Lions Nation, the energy in Detroit feels different today. You know those moments when a team has to show who it truly is? That's exactly what's in front of us right now. This isn't just another matchup, it's a mirror held right up to the franchise, a test of character, identity, and how ready this group is to steady itself after recent turbulence. On the other side comes an opponent stumbling in, full of doubts, shaken by recent decisions that only added more pressure, and a locker room trying to pull itself together. And when you lay all of that out, it becomes clear, this is the kind of game that separates those ready to respond from those still trapped in their own chaos. So before we jump in, hit that like button to support the channel, especially if you've been a Lions fan for over 50 years. And if you can, drop in the comments, "Go Lions, I believe." Still, nothing in this league is guaranteed. Fans know better than anyone that phrases like "should win" have burned Detroit before. The Giants have only a couple of noteworthy wins, an upset over the Eagles and another against the Chargers, but outside of that, it's been a long list of losses, breakdowns, and moments where the team simply couldn't keep up. It's the kind of opponent that gives you confidence on paper but forces you to stay cautious if you've lived through enough Lions football to know how these games can flip when a team overlooks a wounded opponent. Inside the Lions building, though, the focus right now isn't just on New York, it's on the broader picture of the season and the road still ahead. The win-loss projection laid out in the breakdown shows just how high the expectations remain. At 6-4, the path to double-digit wins is right there, and the schedule, while tricky in pockets, sets Detroit up with opportunities to control its destiny. The Giants should get the team to 7 wins. Then comes a 3-game home stretch that could define the entire year. Hosting the Packers on Thanksgiving is never easy. History has made that clear, but the Lions are the better roster right now. That game alone could either fuel a true late-season push or open the door for chaos in the division race. Then there's Dallas coming into Detroit, a matchup where the Cowboys' explosive offense is real but their defense has shown cracks that Detroit can attack if they play clean football. That's followed by the Rams on the road, arguably the toughest remaining challenge. The analysis in the file is blunt. That's the one game where the Lions might simply run into a team that has too much momentum and too many answers on both sides of the ball. Traveling, the matchup issues, that's the one circled as a likely loss. But even with that projected setback, the rest of the path stays wide open. Steelers at home? Winnable. Vikings? A chance to correct the weird, frustrating loss from earlier in the season. Bears in the final week? That game could be a division decider, depending on how both teams navigate the remaining schedule. 11 wins on the low end, 12 on the high end. That's the realistic window the breakdown gives Detroit, and it matches what you see when you stack their schedule next to the Bears, Vikings, and Packers. Chicago has landmines all over their final stretch. Minnesota is essentially written off, drowning in tough matchups and too many losses already. Green Bay's remaining schedule is brutal, and that tie they're carrying makes things even stranger. All of this leads to the bigger conversation. If Detroit wants to avoid the chaos of a wild card race flooded with 7-win teams, it has to finish the job in the division. There's no shortcut. The number 1 seed is out of reach. That door closed with Philadelphia holding the tiebreakers and the momentum, but the number 3 seed is there, waiting for the winner of the NFC North to claim it. And with teams like the Bears, Seahawks, and 49ers all hovering in that crowded wild card picture, every win matters more than ever. So when you look at this Giants matchup, it's not about style points or spreads or betting lines. It's about staying on pace, taking advantage of a struggling opponent, and proving that this team can avoid the kind of mid-season stumble that derails division hopes. The rest of the NFC isn't waiting around, and Detroit can't afford to either. The path is there, the expectation is there, the pressure is definitely there. But the question now is the one the schedule breakdown keeps circling back to. Do you believe this Lions team is truly ready to take control of the division down this final stretch? And picking up right from that question, the truth is this final stretch will test whether Detroit can handle the weight of expectation without slipping into the same patterns that have pulled previous Lions teams off course. The projections laid out in the breakdown make it look simple on paper: beat the Giants, defend home field, survive the Rams trip, take care of business against the Steelers and Vikings, and then show up ready for a possible division-defining matchup with Chicago. But what makes this stretch so fascinating is how quickly everything can swing depending on just one result. A win over New York sets the tone. A loss would ignite full-on panic. That is the reality of a season where every team chasing playoff spots is stacked tightly together. The NFC wildcard race is shaping into something that feels almost unfair. You've got 7-win teams everywhere, no easy escapes, and no clear margin for error. That's why the breakdown emphasizes repeatedly that Detroit can't rely on sliding in through the wild card. they have to take the North outright. The Bears' schedule might give them openings but also has brutal matchups baked in. One week they look dangerous, the next they hit a wall. The Packers have a tougher slate than Detroit and no one knows which version of that team will show up week to week. And Minnesota, for all practical purposes, is already out of the race, stuck with bad matchups and not enough firepower to climb out of the hole. What stands out when you look at all the pieces together is that the Lions aren't chasing an illusion. They're not benefiting from flukes or riding a soft division. They're the team with the clearest road. They're the team with the most stable identity. And despite the frustrations and mistakes from earlier in the year, all of the meaningful season goals remain in front of them. That's rare this late in the season. It's even rarer in Detroit. But this is where the pressure becomes real. Every should-win game becomes a must-win. Every lapse becomes magnified. And every moment where focus slips becomes something that can cost seeding, momentum, and eventually the division itself. That's why this Giants matchup isn't being framed as a celebration opportunity. It's a checkpoint, a test of discipline, a chance for Detroit to show it understands what these games mean, not just for standings, but for proving they can finally handle being the team with a target on its back. The upcoming home stretch is another perfect example. 3 straight games at Ford Field is a gift most teams don't get this late in the year. It's loud, it's hostile for opponents, and it's one of the few environments in the league where momentum can shift sharply because of the energy in the building. But none of that matters if the Lions don't capitalize. Beating Green Bay at home is no longer optional. Taking down Dallas and Detroit is the kind of statement that sets the tone for the postseason. And getting revenge on Minnesota removes any doubt about who truly controls the division this year. If Detroit executes in that run, everything else becomes manageable. If they stumble, the margin for error evaporates instantly. And then comes the Bears, possibly with the division on the line, possibly with playoff seeding hanging in the balance, possibly with the season's narrative waiting to be written in 4 quarters. The Files breakdown viewed that matchup as potentially huge, and it's easy to see why. Chicago isn't an easy out, but Detroit has the tools to win that game, if they arrive healthy, focused, and playing the kind of complementary football that has flashed but hasn't been sustained long enough. In the end, everything from the file points to one truth. This team has the road, the talent, and the opportunity to finish with 11 or 12 wins and walk into the postseason as a legitimate contender. But opportunities don't mean anything unless you attack them. Now the question becomes whether Detroit can not only seize this stretch but show the kind of consistency good teams are supposed to show in November and December. So what do you think, Lions fans? Is this the moment where Detroit finally proves it can finish a season strong, win the division outright, and step into the playoffs with real momentum? Let me know your thoughts. And if you're rocking with the content, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around. There's a video on the screen right now waiting for you. Picking up exactly where we left off, this stretch of the season becomes something bigger than just a sequence of opponents on a schedule. It becomes a referendum on whether this version of the Lions can break the patterns that have haunted past years and finally step fully into the role of a team that doesn't just compete, but closes. The breakdown in the file paints the rest of the NFC as a battleground where every team fighting for a spot is dangerous, flawed, and unpredictable. That's why the emphasis keeps returning to one thing. Detroit must remove every ounce of doubt by taking the division outright. Anything less invites chaos. And chaos is exactly what the NFC wildcard picture is shaping into. You've got 7-win teams stacked on top of each other, each with enough strength to be a real threat and enough inconsistency to drop games they shouldn't. Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, even Green Bay to an extent, none of them give Detroit a comfortable fallback option. That's why the Files analysis kept circling the idea that relying on a wild card bid isn't just risky, it's almost unrealistic. The path must be through the North. What makes Detroit's situation so compelling is that the team's fate is still overwhelmingly in its own hands. The Giants game is the first checkpoint, but it's also the one that sets the tone. You don't build confidence by outmuscling the top teams first. You build it by showing you can dominate the games you're supposed to. Detroit hasn't always done that consistently this year, which is exactly why this week matters. It's not about style points, it's about showing you can prepare, execute, and finish without letting a struggling opponent drag you into unnecessary drama. And once they clear that hurdle, the 3-game home stand becomes the real proving ground. You look at the Files projection, beat Green Bay, take down Dallas, correct the earlier mistake against Minnesota. That sequence is where a real playoff team separates itself. Those are the games where Ford Field becomes more than a building, it becomes an amplifier of opportunity. This roster, even with its bumps and inconsistencies, is good enough to take advantage of that stretch, but the question is whether they've grown enough to be consistent under pressure. Then, almost poetically, the Bears wait at the end of the schedule. A team with enough volatility to be dangerous but enough flaws to be beatable. A rivalry game. A cold weather matchup, potentially a battle for the crown of the NFC North. Everything in the file's breakdown suggested that this could be the game that determines seeding, momentum, and the narrative of the season. Nothing about it will come easy, but that's exactly the kind of challenge that great teams are supposed to meet head-on. So as we transition from projection to reality, the focus turns to the one thing that determines seasons more than any number, stat, or prediction: execution. Detroit has the clearer road. They have the stronger position. They have the more favorable remaining schedule. But none of that matters if they don't take ownership of it in the next few weeks. This isn't about hoping anymore. It's about answering. Do you believe this Lions team can handle the weight of that moment and finally finish the season the way great teams do? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you're enjoying the coverage, hit like, subscribe, and check out the video already on your screen. Picking up directly from where we left off, and staying strictly within the limits of what the file provides, the only thing left to expand on is the weight of the situation itself, because the document makes it clear that everything surrounding the Lions right now is defined not by new developments, but by the implications of the schedule, the state of the division, and the reality of how tight the playoff race already is. The file repeatedly circles one central theme: the Detroit Lions are in the strongest position among NFC North teams because of the schedule in front of them, not because the race is weak. The Bears have a brutal path. The Packers have an even tougher one, with matchups against teams like the Broncos and Ravens that aren't forgiving. The Vikings simply don't have enough left in the tank to climb out of their hole. That creates a dynamic where Detroit isn't just leading, they're leading in a division where every other competitor faces a wall of challenges. But this also means something else. Pressure increases, because the Lions are the team with the most to lose. The projections inside the file, the 11-12 win expectation, aren't fantasy numbers or hype pieces. They're logical outcomes based on the remaining opponents. And when logic is on your side, anything less than meeting those expectations becomes a disappointment. That's where the emotional weight grows for the fans and for the team itself. Detroit has never been in a position where it was expected to go into December as the team with the clearest path to the division crown. Usually, Detroit is clawing from behind, hoping for help, praying for something to break their way. This year, the break has already been handed to them. Now they have to protect it. The file's tone makes it obvious that the Giants game isn't being treated as a celebration opportunity but as a checkpoint of discipline, a moment that reveals whether the Lions can show maturity by handling the games good teams are supposed to win. Because once that hurdle is passed, the real test becomes the mental toughness to handle the 3-game home run. That stretch is the pivot point of the entire season. If Detroit delivers there, the rest of the story writes itself. If they falter, the division becomes a dogfight again, and all the advantages the schedule gives them evaporate instantly. And that's why the document ends with such urgency. Not panic, urgency. A recognition that this is the most realistic, achievable route to a division title Detroit has had in recent memory. A recognition that the wild card path is far too cramped, unpredictable, and dangerous to rely on. And a recognition that this team has reached the stage where expectations can no longer be shrugged off as hopeful dreams. They're real, they're deserved, and they're earned by the structure of the schedule and the performance to this point. So everything comes down to response. Response to pressure, response to expectations, response to the moment. The file makes it clear that the Lions can get to the postseason as a top 3 seed. It also makes it clear that they can't afford to slip mentally, even once, because the NFC is too crowded to give them a cushion. Now the only question that remains, the one that the schedule breakdown leads us to, the one the playoff picture magnifies, the one fans feel in their chest more than anything, is this. Continuing from that exact point, with no shift in tone and staying fully aligned with the information from the file, everything now centers on how the Lions respond in a moment where expectation becomes a test of identity. Because when a team reaches this stage of the season with a realistic path to double-digit wins, a favorable remaining schedule, and a division that can be taken without relying on miracles, the narrative stops being about potential and starts being about accountability. Every part of the breakdown in the document points toward the same truth. Detroit has the most straightforward road among the NFC North teams, but straightforward doesn't mean easy. The Giants game is the start, the first step in a sequence where Detroit has to prove it can handle the matchups that should tilt in their favor. The file called this the get-right game, and that's a meaningful label, not because of the Giants' struggles, not because of the injuries, and not because of their head coach firing, but because good teams use games like this to stabilize themselves. It's not about running up the score. It's about proving discipline, focus, and a willingness to play clean football after weeks of inconsistency. And once they clear that hurdle, the narrative becomes about momentum. The 3-game home stretch is the kind of opportunity the Lions haven't had in years, a chance to stack wins at Ford Field, to feed off a building that has become one of the loudest in the league, and to force opponents into uncomfortable environments. Hosting the Packers on Thanksgiving, hosting the Cowboys in a matchup where Detroit has advantages, hosting the Vikings with a chance to erase the memory of an earlier slip. These aren't just games, they are checkpoints. Each one is a chance to prove that Detroit doesn't fold under pressure but grows stronger because of it. What the file also underscores is that the Rams game is the only matchup projected as a probable loss. Not because Detroit isn't capable, but because of the circumstances, the travel, the matchup problems, the timing. That makes everything around it even more crucial. If Detroit is going to drop a game, it has to ensure the foundation around that loss is solid. A stumble against Los Angeles is survivable. A stumble combined with a misstep against a division opponent quickly becomes a disaster. That focus on context is why the document invests so much energy in breaking down the Bears, Packers, and Vikings schedules. Chicago faces a gauntlet. Green Bay has an unforgiving mix of opponents. Minnesota simply doesn't have enough left to threaten the race. In every projection, Detroit remains the team with the inside track. But projections don't win divisions. Execution does. Consistency does. Handling pressure does. And that brings everything back to this central moment, a point where the Lions aren't hoping for help, aren't praying for collapses, aren't waiting for another team to trip. They control their road. They control their opportunity. And they control the way this division ends. The playoffs are within reach. A division title is within reach. A top 3 seed is within reach. But the thing the file makes clear, over and over again, is that none of it matters unless Detroit proves it can manage the expectations attached to being the favorite, not the underdog. So with all of that laid out, the schedule, the matchups, the projections, the stakes, there's only one question left that truly matters as the Lions head into this final stretch. Do you trust this team to take advantage of the clearest path they've had in years and finish the season as the NFC North champion? Continuing directly from that point, with the same tone, the same perspective, and still rooted only in what the file provides, everything now shifts toward the reality that this moment in the season is not just about opportunity, but about proving maturity. The document makes it clear that the Lions are entering a stretch where the smallest lapse could swing the entire playoff picture, because even though Detroit holds the most favorable path, the NFC landscape around them is packed with teams capable of climbing, slipping, or reshaping the standings in a single week. That's why the urgency in the file isn't rooted in fear, but in understanding. The Lions don't just have a chance to win the division, they have a responsibility to rise to the moment. They have the schedule advantage, they have the clearer slate, and they have fewer obstacles compared to the rest of the NFC North. But that only matters if they treat every opponent as if the playoffs start now. That's the tone reflected in the breakdown. There's no room for mental shortcuts, no room for assuming outcomes, no room for letting an inferior opponent drag Detroit into the kind of sloppy, frustrating game that ends up haunting you in January. Because when you look at how the file details the Bears, Packers, and Vikings, one theme stands out. The rest of the division is inconsistent enough that Detroit should stay in control, but dangerous enough that Detroit can't slip. Chicago has a schedule loaded with tough matchups that could knock them off at any point, but they're unpredictable enough to steal games that matter in the race. Green Bay's remaining schedule is a grind, full of teams that can expose their flaws, yet they also have streaky stretches that make them a threat if Detroit stumbles. Minnesota, for all practical purposes, is too far behind to truly threaten the Lions, but the file doesn't treat them as a non-factor, it treats them as a team Detroit must beat to secure the cleanest possible finish. And that's where the emotional reality of this moment comes in. The Lions aren't just fighting for wins, they're fighting for control. Control of the division, control of their postseason path, control of the narrative that has followed this franchise for decades. Because in seasons past, Detroit needed external help. They needed collapses from rivals. They needed upsets across the league. This year, they need none of that. Everything is in their hands, and the weight of that responsibility is exactly what turns this final stretch into something much larger than just football. Combine that with the file's acknowledgement that the number 1 seed is out of reach due to Philadelphia locking down their position, and what remains becomes even clearer. Detroit's goal isn't the top of the NFC. It's about securing the best possible footing beneath the top tier, a position that gives them a home playoff game, a manageable opponent, and a chance to build real postseason momentum. That number 3 seed isn't a consolation prize, it's the gateway to a legitimate shot at making noise in January. Continuing directly from where we left off, and still staying strictly within the boundaries of what the file provides, without inventing new events, new players, or new details, the only direction left is to take the implications of that schedule breakdown and push them to their natural emotional conclusion. Because when you step back and look at everything the document lays out, the season comes down to something far bigger than matchups on paper. It comes down to whether the Lions can finally become the version of themselves they've been building toward for years. The file paints a picture of a team with every structural advantage, not through luck, not through outside help, but through the reality of the schedule and the performances that have already put Detroit ahead of its rivals. That's the thread running through the entire breakdown. The Lions aren't chasing anymore, they're maintaining. And maintaining is harder than climbing. It requires consistency over excitement, discipline over emotion, maturity over adrenaline. And that's exactly why the schedule analysis in the file spends so much time comparing Detroit's road to the roads of Chicago, Green Bay, and Minnesota. It's not to diminish those teams, it's to emphasize that this is the moment where Detroit must show it understands what leadership in the division looks like. Because while those teams face steeper climbs, Detroit faces the test of staying steady while knowing the pressure sits squarely on their shoulders. The Giants game, for example, isn't framed as a showdown. It's framed as a necessity, one the Lions are expected to handle. And that expectation is what marks the shift in who Detroit is supposed to be now. Good teams take care of the games they're expected to win. They don't let chaos seep in. They don't play down. They don't get dragged into unnecessary battles. They assert control. They establish rhythm. They turn should win into did win. And then the heart of the schedule, that 3-game homestand, becomes the moment that defines whether Detroit is truly ready for the responsibility the file lays on them. Because playing at home, with the division on the line, with the crowd behind you, is both an advantage and a test. You have more support, more noise, more energy, but you also have more eyes on you, more expectation, more pressure. And it's in that environment where a team reveals what it actually is, not what the numbers say it could be. The file's acknowledgement that the Rams game may be the one loss left on the schedule is actually part of what intensifies everything else. When you know your toughest matchup is coming, you don't waste energy elsewhere. You handle your business in the games that lean in your favor so that a projected loss carries no weight. That's the difference between a team that hopes for the playoffs and a team that dictates its postseason position. And then, beyond that, there's the final stretch against division opponents, games that carry emotional weight even before standings are involved. The file shows how critical those matchups become once you factor in the Bears' difficult schedule, the Packers' inconsistent path, and the Vikings' fading hopes. Rivalry games are rarely easy, but in a season where everything is in Detroit's hands, they become the final checkpoints for a team that can no longer afford to drift. All of this returns to the same pressure point. The Lions must take advantage of the remaining schedule. The Giants matchup, the Packers, the Cowboys, the Vikings, the Steelers, these games aren't just boxes to check. They're opportunities to show that this team understands exactly what it takes to turn a promising season into something meaningful. Because the NFC wildcard picture is far too crowded, far too volatile, and far too competitive to rely on anything other than winning the North. And that's why the file closes on a simple idea. The Lions still have the best shot to finish on top of the division, but it depends entirely on their ability to handle the final stretch with discipline, urgency, and consistency. So I'll leave you with the same spirit the breakdown builds toward. Do you think this Lions team has finally reached the point where it can close out a season with authority and claim the division the way a true playoff contender should? Let me know what you think. Picking up exactly where we left off, and staying strictly inside the boundaries of the information from the file, what remains to be said is less about new facts and more about what this moment represents for the Lions as they stare at the final stretch of the season. Because the file's breakdown makes one thing unmistakably clear: Detroit is no longer the team chasing chaos. They are the team trying to avoid it. The Giants matchup is the first signal of that. On paper, it is a game Detroit should control from start to finish. The file spells it out plainly. New York is in freefall, dealing with injuries, uncertainty, and a coaching change that sent the entire operation sideways. That's why the spread is so large. But the real significance of this game isn't the score. It's whether Detroit can show they understand the responsibility of being a team favored this heavily. Good teams build momentum in games like this. They don't let them drag on. They don't let a struggling opponent hang around. They don't play with their food. And once that starting point is established, the real test becomes the sequence of opponents that follow. The file emphasizes the importance of Detroit's 3 straight home games not because the opponents are easy, but because this is a rare chance to control the emotional and competitive heartbeat of the season inside Ford Field. Hosting the Packers on Thanksgiving is never a simple task. History alone proves that. But Detroit is the better roster, the better coached team, and the one with the clearer direction right now. Then comes Dallas, a team with a great offense but a defense that gives Detroit opportunities if they execute. Then Minnesota, a team that beat Detroit earlier in the year in a strange, frustrating game that the Lions know they should have closed out. That stretch isn't just a trio of matchups. It's the defining chapter of the season. Win those games, and the Lions walk into the final weeks with confidence, cushion, and control. Slip even once, and the division becomes a race that no longer favors them as strongly. The document is equally blunt about the Rams matchup, the one game it projects as a likely loss. Not because Detroit lacks talent, but because traveling to face a high-performing team at the wrong time in the season is the type of challenge even great teams struggle with. In a way, that game becomes a mental marker. If Detroit enters that week with momentum, a loss won't shake their footing. If they enter it wobbling, the entire season can tilt. And that's exactly why the breakdown of the Bears, Packers, and Vikings schedules matters so much. Chicago's end-of-season gauntlet is brutal. The Packers face a string of opponents capable of knocking them out of rhythm at every turn, and the Vikings are effectively out of realistic contention. When you lay all of that out, Detroit isn't just the favorite, they're the team with the obligation to finish stronger than the rest. They have the advantage, but the advantage only holds if they perform at the level expected of a team positioned for 11 or 12 wins. What the file really shows is that this season is no longer about surprise. It's about fulfillment. The Lions are in a spot where their goals are logical, achievable, and fully within their hands. But that's exactly what raises the stakes, because expectations bring pressure. Pressure reveals discipline, and discipline decides seasons. Every part of what's left, the Giants matchup, the home stretch, the Rams game, the division rivals' trajectories, the playoff picture, all points to the same conclusion. Detroit's path is right in front of them, clearly defined, but unforgiving if they hesitate even once. So with everything on the line, every opportunity laid out, and every expectation now real rather than hypothetical, the question becomes the one the file leads us toward with every projection, every comparison, and every matchup breakdown. Continuing seamlessly from that point, and still staying strictly within the boundaries of what the file provides, what remains now is the understanding of what this stretch means for the identity of the Detroit Lions. Because when you examine the tone of the breakdown, you can feel that the season has reached a stage where numbers, projections, and hypotheticals matter far less than consistency, execution, and resilience. The file lays out the matchups, the schedules of the division rivals, the expected wins and losses, but underneath all of that is a deeper question about who the Lions are when the pressure is highest. The truth is that Detroit is walking into a moment the franchise hasn't experienced often. They're not hunting, they're being hunted. They're not sneaking up on anyone, they're the team the rest of the division is measuring itself against. The file makes clear that Chicago, Green Bay, and Minnesota are all navigating tougher schedules and far more volatile paths. That's what puts Detroit in the driver's seat. Not luck, not flukes, but a position earned through the first 10 games and maintained through a stretch of matchups that still tilt in their favor. But when you're in the driver's seat, the pressure isn't about catching up, it's about not losing control. Every should win becomes mandatory. Every home game becomes a statement about maturity. Every close contest becomes a test of whether the Lions can finally separate themselves from the versions of the team that collapsed under similar pressure in past seasons. The file's emphasis on the home stretch underscores exactly that. 3 straight games inside Ford Field is not normal this late in the season. It's an opportunity very few teams get, and even fewer take full advantage of. That environment, that noise, that energy, all of it becomes fuel if the Lions stay sharp. But the moment they slip, the moment they treat any opponent lightly, the entire foundation becomes fragile. That's the razor's edge the document captures so well. The path is there, but the margin for error is practically non-existent. And that's why the wild card scenario is painted as something Detroit cannot afford to rely on. The NFC landscape is too crowded. There are too many 7-win teams. Too many dangerous matchups left for other contenders. Too many unpredictable swings still ahead. The division isn't just the cleanest path, it's the only path that gives Detroit the footing they need to make a real push in January. So now, as all the elements of the season converge, the Giants game is the reset point, the home stretch is the proving ground, the Rams matchup is the likely hurdle, the division rivals scrambling through tougher schedules, the Lions arrive at a moment that isn't defined by numbers anymore. It's defined by posture, by composure, by whether this team can carry the weight that comes with being in control of its own future. Everything the file lays out builds toward the same simple but unavoidable conclusion. This is Detroit's clearest chance in years to close out a season on their own terms. The path isn't cushioned, but it's clear. The rivals aren't collapsing, but they're disadvantaged. The expectations aren't fantasies, they're realistic. And now, the only thing that matters is whether the Lions match the urgency of the moment with the discipline of a team that understands what is at stake. Because with every projection pointing toward 11 or 12 wins, with every rival facing steeper obstacles, and with every remaining game placing Detroit closer to the postseason, the season no longer hinges on potential. It hinges on finishing, continuing directly from where we left off, and still staying strictly inside the limits of the information from the file. The only space left to explore is the emotional and competitive weight of this final stretch, because the document ends by pressing one final idea. This entire season now hinges on Detroit's ability to avoid self-inflicted setbacks. Nothing in the file suggests new injuries, roster surprises, or dramatic shifts. What it does present, clearly and repeatedly, is a picture of a team standing in the middle of an NFC field where every contender is grinding through a tough road while Detroit's path remains the most navigable, if they take it seriously. That's why the tone of the breakdown is so pointed. It's not begging fans to fear the Bears' resurgence, or to panic about Green Bay, or to stress over the Vikings. Instead, it frames those teams as obstacles that only become meaningful if Detroit loses focus. Chicago has a difficult schedule loaded with games they're projected to lose. Green Bay is dealing with opponents who will test them weekly. Minnesota simply doesn't have enough ground left to cover, even in their best-case scenarios. All of that pushes the spotlight back onto one team, Detroit. The file's analysis repeatedly uses the word should. The Lions should beat the Giants, should beat the Packers, should win at home against Dallas despite their offense, should handle the Steelers, should correct the mistake against Minnesota. But should is a dangerous word in football. It's a word built on logic and expectation, not execution. And execution is where seasons are won or lost. That's the underlying message in the document. Detroit is in a position where the biggest threat to their postseason push is not their rival teams, it's themselves. The path to 11 or 12 wins isn't dependent on luck or upsets elsewhere. It's dependent on whether the Lions can stop playing down to opponents, avoid the mistakes that cost them earlier games, and maintain the level of discipline required to close out a season as a contender instead of a hopeful outsider. And this is where the emotional weight hits the fan base. The Lions are rarely in a position where the numbers expect them to win the division. The file lays out projections that point clearly to Detroit finishing with the best record in the NFC North. It maps out rival schedules that are harder at every turn. It frames Detroit as the team with the highest floor and the clearest path. That's not a spot this franchise is used to being in, and that unfamiliar territory brings its own pressure. But it also brings an opportunity that Lions fans don't get often, the ability to watch the final stretch of the season knowing that the team's fate is controlled internally, not dictated by out-of-town scoreboards. The analysis in the file shows that the only game Detroit is truly expected to struggle in is against the Rams. Everything else is winnable. Everything else is within reach. Everything else is about execution rather than mismatches or deficit climbing. That's what makes this moment so pivotal. Detroit has the advantage, the runway, and the structure to finish strong. The rest of the contenders in the NFC North are dealing with harder schedules, tougher opponents, or deeper holes. But none of that means anything if Detroit doesn't seize the stretch in front of them. It's not enough to rely on what rivals might do. The Lions have to dictate the outcome themselves, and according to the file, they're more than capable of doing exactly that. So as we wrap up this continuation, the heart of the story remains unchanged. This season now depends on focus, discipline, and the ability to finish what they started. The division is there. The path is there. The expectations are finally aligned with reality. Picking up exactly from where we left off, and without adding anything outside the information in the file, there's still one more angle that deserves to be explored, because the tone of the breakdown makes something very clear. This entire conversation isn't just about games, scores, or predictions. It's about the emotional weight of expectation finally landing on a team and a fan base that spent decades waiting for a moment like this. That's what makes this stretch so compelling. The file doesn't present Detroit as a miracle story or an underdog trying to upset the league. It presents them as a team that has earned its standing, built a legitimate path, and positioned itself stronger than its rivals. The Bears' difficult slate, the Packers' brutal remaining matchups, the Vikings effectively sitting too far behind, all of it creates a rare scenario where Detroit is not reacting to the division, but defining it. And that shift, from chasing to leading, is the real test the document is pointing to. Because when Detroit was the team trying to claw into the playoff picture, pressure felt different. There was nothing to lose. Every win felt like a surprise. Every good moment felt like a bonus. But now every win feels expected. Every game carries weight. Every mistake is magnified. And that's a completely different psychological landscape. That's why the file focuses so heavily on the Giants matchup as a tone setter rather than a marquee game. It's not about proving dominance. It's about proving discipline. Good teams establish rhythm against struggling opponents. Good teams don't let the pressure of "you should win this" create anxiety. They handle business, move forward, and save their emotional energy for the games that truly require it. And then comes the core stretch that the document really frames as the backbone of the season, those 3 straight home games. There's something powerful about having the opportunity to stack wins in your own building, with your own crowd, in the heart of the schedule. Ford Field becomes the stage where the Lions either confirm they're ready for the weight of first place or reveal cracks under pressure. And the breakdown is clear. Those games are winnable, but winnable doesn't mean guaranteed. It means Detroit has the advantage, but only if they play to their potential. The Rams matchup stands alone in the file as the one game where the analysis leans toward a loss. And ironically, that honesty is what makes the projection credible. It acknowledges the reality of traveling, matchups, and form, and that honesty reinforces just how critical all the other games become. One projected loss is manageable. One slip in addition to that projected loss? Suddenly, the division becomes complicated again. And that's the underlying tension the file captures so well. Detroit has the cleaner path, but no cushion. They have the easier schedule, but no room for complacency. They have the momentum opportunities, but no guarantee they'll seize them. So the weight shifts to the intangible, the part of the season no schedule analysis can fully capture, the part that comes down to consistency, maturity, and the ability to maintain identity late in the year when the pressure becomes harder to ignore. Because every division contending team eventually reaches a moment where talent and matchups matter less than resilience and focus. The file leaves us standing right on the edge of that moment. And so the only thing left to ask, the question that sits underneath every projection, every win-loss estimate, every breakdown of rival schedules, and every expectation placed on this team, is this. Do you believe the Lions will take advantage of the most favorable position they've had in years and close out this season with the consistency and strength of a true division champion? Continuing directly from where we left off, and still remaining entirely within the boundaries of what the file provides, without adding new facts, the only direction left is to deepen the meaning of what this moment represents, because the document repeatedly circles one truth. The Lions are standing in a position where the final outcome of the season depends less on the opponents ahead of them and more on whether they can maintain the mental and competitive sharpness required to finish. That's the real heart of the breakdown. The file lays out the schedules. It evaluates every remaining matchup. It compares Detroit's path to that of Chicago, Green Bay, and Minnesota. And every one of those comparisons leads to the same conclusion. The Lions have the advantage, but advantage alone doesn't win divisions. Execution does. Consistency does. And the ability to navigate pressure does. What makes this stretch so unique is that Detroit doesn't need luck from other teams. They don't need heartbreak from rivals. They don't need unlikely upsets across the league. In past seasons, those things were the only hope. But this time, the file shows a scenario where Detroit's goals rely almost entirely on what they themselves do over the next several weeks. That shift in control is massive. It's something this franchise hasn't been used to historically, and that's why the breakdown feels so heavy, not negative, not fearful, but weighty. When the Lions were climbing from behind, any win felt like a blessing. Any streak felt like momentum. Now, every win is simply maintaining the lead they're supposed to have. Every loss is magnified because they're in a position where expectations finally match opportunity. And that's what makes the next few weeks more than just football games. They're a test of emotional maturity as much as competitive ability. The file emphasizes the Giants game as a necessary tone setter, because good teams show control in games they're expected to win. They build rhythm. They reinforce habits. They don't let weaker opponents dictate tempo or confidence. And that's exactly why the document underscores that one word over and over, should. The Lions should beat the Giants. They should beat the Packers. They should handle the Steelers. They should get redemption against the Vikings. They should finish with 11 or 12 wins. But the file also makes it clear that should becomes meaningless if the team doesn't treat every moment with the urgency that playoff contenders must show in the final stretch of a season. And that urgency grows even more important when the Rams game, the only matchup the breakdown flags as likely being a loss, sits right in the path. How Detroit handles the games around that challenge will determine everything, because that's the difference between a team hoping for January and a team preparing for January. How you handle the games that bookend your toughest matchup. If Detroit enters that Rams week with momentum, a loss won't shake them. If they enter it unfocused, the ripple effects can derail the entire division race. And by the time the Lions reach the final week, possibly facing Chicago with the division at stake, everything the file laid out comes full circle. The Lions have the clearer road, the stronger foundation, and the more favorable matchups. But none of that becomes real unless they find a way to maintain identity under pressure, avoid self-inflicted wounds, and deliver the kind of steady, composed football that good teams play in November and December. So now the season stands at a point where the numbers, projections, and schedules have all been laid out. The document gives you every reason why the Lions should finish on top, but it also makes something unmistakably clear. Detroit must rise to the expectations that come with that position. And so the question remains, the final question the entire breakdown leads us toward. Do you believe the Lions have the discipline, the focus, and the consistency to finish this stretch with authority and claim the NFC North the way this file shows they should?